Bonjour tout le monde. Hello and welcome to this session of the MISC annual conference, which is focusing on environment and climate change. Je vais maintenant vous présenter le modérateur, Mike de Souza. Mike de Souza is the managing editor of the Narwhal and an award-winning investigative journalist specializing in covering environmental issues and the energy industry. He has also covered politics for more than 2 decades. A Montreal native, Mike has worked as a broadcast and print journalist in his hometown, as well as the National Assembly in Quebec City, Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Toronto, and Calgary. Along the way, he has worked for Global News, Reuters, Postmedia, the Montreal Gazette, CJAD, CTV, and National Observer. We are very grateful to have him with us to lead the discussion today. Mike, c'est à vous de jouer. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel. Thanks very much. So I'm excited to be moderating this panel on environment and climate change in Canada. Depending on who you ask, a lot has changed or not much has changed in the climate policy space globally over the past few decades. The warnings from scientists are there. The language from most governments admit that there's a problem, and most of the specific and assessments and reviews, the scientific assessments and reviews seem to show that we aren't doing enough to solve the problem. In the past few weeks, we've seen more policy advice from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about the risks of climate disaster and what we need to avoid to avoid the worst outcomes. We've also seen the International Energy Agency signal that the era of growth in demand for oil, gas, and coal is coming to an end sooner than the fossil fuel industry would have you believe. And there are hundreds of thousands of workers around the world who are now facing the prospects of not knowing if the planet can support all of their jobs over the next decade. So we have a lot to discuss over the next hour or so. And I'd like to begin by introducing and thanking our panelists in advance who have joined us to lend their invaluable perspectives to this conversation. We'll hear brief remarks from each of them, and I'll ask each of them some questions about the future of climate change, environmental policy, and more. So maybe I'll just go through with some brief introductions of everyone. Susanna Fuller is Vice President, Operations and Projects at Oceans North. Her work focuses on achieving tangible conservation outcomes in sustainable fisheries and spatial protections in Atlantic Canada and the Arctic, as well as initiatives to protect high seas biodiversity. She completed her PhD at Dalhousie University, including research on North Atlantic marine sponge populations, and has worked for the past decade and a half on the science policy interface for national and international fisheries and ocean conservation. Before joining Oceans North, she led the marine team at Ecology Action Center in Halifax, where she lives. Second, the Honorable Thomas Mulcair was leader of the New Democratic Party from 2012 to 2017 and leader of the opposition from 2012 to 2015. He was elected 3 times to Quebec's National Assembly. He is the author of Quebec's landmark Sustainable Development Act when he was Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment and Parks in Quebec. And he is visiting professor in the Political Science Department at Université de Montréal. And Dr. Suzanne Simard is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, where she currently leads the Mother Tree Project and co-directs Below Ground Ecosystem Group. Dr. Simard has earned a global reputation for pioneering research on tree connectivity and communication and studying the impact on the productivity, health, and biodiversity of forests. Her work has been published widely with over 170 scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, Ecology, Global Biology, and she has co-authored the book Climate Change and Variability. So starting in alphabetical order again, maybe with introductions, let's maybe perhaps go to you first, Susanna. And you're on mute.
You'd think after 2.5 years of Zooming, to get off mute. So thank you for including me in this panel. It's an honor to be here as both a McGill alumni and with my esteemed fellow panelists, both of whom I have an incredible amount of respect for. So this is a delight. Maybe I'll just start with a little personal anecdote as to how I got involved in the work that I do, and that leads to where I think Canada needs to go in terms of protecting oceans and coasts, and including those in both its biodiversity ambitions, and as well as really linking climate back to back to our biodiversity ambitions. Sorry. So I spent my last year of high school sailing on a tall ship, and it was the year of the cod collapse. And I remember we only got a few pieces of news while we were across the Atlantic. It was before the time of cell phones and internet, so very luxurious. But the one thing we caught when we had a fishing rod over the back of the ship was a piece of plastic. And somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, I remember news coming in that the cod fishery had been shut down. And at that time, it was the largest population collapse in the world. And that really galvanized, I think, my idea that maybe I should try and do something about that, whether or not I could or not, I should at least try. And then later, a few years later, after completing my studies at McGill, I did spend a summer quantifying the bycatch of the scallop fishery in the Bay of Fundy, and I found that there was 200 other species that came up. And those two things kind of made me think that we need to, one, manage our fisheries better, and also really pay attention to the impacts on biodiversity. And so the third thing I will say is that I grew up in rural Nova Scotia, and I have a really strong sense of the importance of the ocean to coastal communities, to providing livelihoods, and to non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, and that importance going forward. We've seen a lot more interest by Indigenous communities in fisheries over the past few years. And so we have I guess, growing pressure, I would say, on a marine ecosystem that's somewhat in decline, on fisheries we have not managed to rebuild, and an increasing demand for those resources, given that the ocean still produces, some of the last wild protein that we harvest. And, in the course of my career, I've noticed that, particularly in the last decade, we've started to pay a lot more attention to climate and the impacts it will have on some of the interventions that we're making in terms of sustainable fisheries management, where we should best protect areas, and whether or not climate will undo some of the other work we're doing on reducing human stressors. At the same time, we know that the oceans have absorbed about 90% of the excess heat that has been created by climate change. Canada has the longest coastline in the world. We are one of the few countries that border on 3 ocean basins: the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. And sea ice is a critical part of our natural infrastructure for so many of our really charismatic species, from polar bears and narwhal to whales, as well as for Inuit. And we are increasingly, the ice melt and the permafrost melt is devastating to many communities. I often think about, what would happen if we saw the 401 start to melt, right? It just started to disappear. That is the case with many winter transportation routes in the Arctic. So when I think about Canada's leadership on this, I am sometimes, I would say, disappointed and trying to be hopeful, though, that we often forget the oceans and coast in our climate ambitions. And so I know we'll get to say more on this topic, but I can't emphasize enough that Canada has an outsized role to play when it comes to leading on protection of the marine environment, reducing the impacts of ocean industries on both climate emissions and protecting natural carbon sources. And we have a responsibility to ensure that this work brings us further along the path of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. And so I always have to think about the cup being half full. At the same time, the urgency of the COP26 that's coming up, and the global biodiversity meetings, how what Canada does and says there will make a difference on what we do at home.
Thank you. And over to you, Tom.
Well, that was a great introduction and overview by Susanna, and I want to say a big thank you, because it segs with my vision of things, because she's very results oriented in her work. And whether it's in my work in politics before, now in the university, or in my role as the chairman of Earth Day Canada, I've always been concentrated on results. And that's one of the things, obviously, as Susanna has just pointed out, that's been missing in Canada's approach. If we go back to when we signed Kyoto, there was a lot of promise, but then we had one of the worst records in the world for greenhouse gas increases. We were, in fact, the first country to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, and there have only been a couple of others who did that. And since the Paris Accord was signed, our results haven't been great either. I did spend a lot of time in public administration before going into politics. And I mean, it's trite to say it that way, but one of the things that I've noticed is that in public administration, if the tools of public policy that you're using aren't producing the result, try something else. Because the only thing that really matters in the fight that we're in right now is, in fact, the result: reducing greenhouse gases, avoiding tragic consequences of predicted global warming well above 1.5 degrees Celsius in this century. The good news is, and there is good news in this, is that there are models that exist of things that we've done in the past that show we're capable of rising to the challenge. Back in the 1960s, height of the Cold War, John F. Kennedy is informed by scientists that measuring the pulp in the baby teeth of children around the world, you could find strontium-90. And despite the fact that they were often at daggers drawn, Americans, Soviets decided to have a test ban treaty to put an end. There was an emotional connection with the idea that this was affecting children, their bodies, their health. And maybe that's the type of emotional connection that's sometimes difficult to achieve with global warming and climate change. When Reagan, who was anything but a scientist, was informed that there was a big hole opening up in the ozone layer, he didn't hesitate. The world came together, and here in Montreal, the Montreal Protocol was signed to reduce and eliminate eventually CFCs. There have been other problems as that's rolled out, but there's a whole industry there, especially air conditioning and others, that are dealing with it. There's a result that's being achieved around the world on this very important issue. So too with acid rain. And Canadian government at the time, it was Mulroney who identified this as a priority, got together with Bush in the US, and we put in place the first and very successful cap and trade system. It wasn't with CO2, it was with SO2, but it was raining sulfuric acid across the Northeast US and Southeast Canada. We were able to find a solution and deal with it. That's what we have to do now. We have to find the things that work and actually do them, because the speeches have been given. I was there in the room in Paris in 2015, where Canada, proclaimed through our prime minister that Canada was back. And I took that as a hopeful message. But then when we got back home, we learned that that meant coming back with Stephen Harper's targets, timelines, and plan. And of course, that hasn't worked, and we haven't even done that. I do think that there's a lot of hope as we head into Glasgow. The world is starting to take notice, realizing that we can't continue doing as we were doing before. We're going to have to get it done. It's our obligation, and it's going to take the best minds, as it has for other big problems in the past. But I'm convinced we can do it if we're sincere about it. The challenge, of course, is we learned that in the last year, the first full year of the mandate of Joe Biden, the United States has actually increased how much coal it burns by 23% over the last year of Donald Trump's administration. Canada is going to be increasing a lot our production from the oil sands, for example, this year, because there is a great deal of need and demand for energy in the world. That just heightens the challenge. It's going to make the problem more difficult. So I'm thrilled to be part of this panel today and to start looking at some of those solutions, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention, Mike, when you went through that extraordinary curriculum vitae of Suzanne Simard, when you talked about the fact that she's been published widely, I do think that we have to mention that about 100 million people around the world learned about her work a couple of weeks ago, when her work was cited in no less a source than Ted Lasso, right on the air. And so I'm rarely intimidated by being on a panel with people, but being on the same panel as somebody who was just quoted on Ted Lasso, well, it puts me in my place. Thanks for the invitation. Suzanne, merci d'être là. Félicitations pour cette citation, mais plus sérieusement, pour votre travail unique, extraordinaire que vous avez fait, comme vous l'avez si bien mentionné, depuis des décennies.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, and that's a great segue to Suzanne. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Susanna. And I have to say, I feel like I'm the least qualified person on this panel to be here, but I think I do offer some insights on forests. And and of course, since I'm now famous because of Ted Lasso, I need to use that platform to elevate my concerns about forests and climate change. So thanks, Ted Lasso, and thanks, Tom, for mentioning that. One of the reasons I'm just going to say that he mentioned my work was because I just published a book called Finding the Mother Tree. And I'm going to sort of go through what that book tells us, because I think it shows a hopeful path. But first, we have to take this seriously. So I'm just going to start by talking about the importance of forests in global change to start. So forests cover about 1/3 of our terrestrial land area, but they're hugely important. They have an outsized importance in all ecological processes in the terrestrial systems. So even though they only cover 1/3 of the land, they actually store 80% of terrestrial carbon. They're sources of 80% of our clean water in Canada, and they house about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So that 80% always kind of floats up. It's a major outsized contribution to our global issues, things that are under threat now. So in Canada, I would say overall there's a lot of room for improvement. I'm going to talk about that, but there was, I'm just going to, emphasize, like, why do I know this? Well, there's been a number of reports done on disturbance in forest ecosystems across Canada. And a few years ago, the Global Resources Institute published an article saying that our rate of disturbance of forests in Canada actually exceeds that of Brazil. And why is that? Well, it's because of logging, it's because of oil and gas development, it's because of increasing wildfires, increasing drought stresses, land use conversion. And so this is something where we, knowing these facts, facts matter, it also helps us point to where we can make some improvements. So, but before I get into what those improvements can be, I just want to give you a little bit of background on my story. I actually am in Nelson, British Columbia. Nelson is in the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan nations, 3 of 201 nations recognized in British Columbia. My work covers a lot of the nations. I work with about 10 of the larger nations in British Columbia in my research. I grew up in the heart of these forests, in the Chepamek territory, in the inland rainforests. And my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my dad, and uncles were all horse loggers who moved across from Quebec in the late 1800s, settled in this area, and started logging. And it was just like a family operation. And it was selective harvesting, where they took out small trees, sometimes large trees too, but it was such a light touch on the landscape that as a child, when I grew up in these forests, I saw them and grew up to know them as resilient places. They just rebounded. All of the seeds, the spores, the soil, the leaves were left in place to provide a platform for the next generation of forests. And then I followed my family footsteps and became a forester myself. And I started practicing forestry in the early 1980s. And this is when industrial forestry had completely taken over forest practices in our province, and I would argue across Canada. And that was not small scale selective logging, it was clear cutting. And this clear cutting has gone on has actually increased its rate since the 1960s and 70s to now, where we're consistently clear cutting about 70 million cubic meters of wood every year from British Columbia. That's a very large amount. It's unchanged in spite of the pressures on our forests from wildfires and global change, and also deforestation due to oil and gas and so on. And so what are the consequences of this? The consequences are that I grew up in a province of old growth forests, and now I live in a province of clear cuts. This is heartbreaking. It's not only ecologically, but emotionally, socially. It's very difficult for British Columbians to watch their beautiful forests become this industrial landscape. Consequences are, that we have simplified forests now, that we're really a province of clear cuts and simple plantations with little bits of old growth left in between. Just to bring a point to that, a recent analysis showed that overall in the high iconic valley bottom forests, we only have, of these kinds of forests, 3% left. Of the remaining, it's under 10%. This is tragic, and it certainly flies in the face of what conservation biologists are saying, that we need to conserve 30 to 50% of our natural ecosystems to combat or to deal with climate change. So there's a lot of work to be done. Some of the consequences of this industrial harvesting of our forests are we have floods, we have wildfires, we have droughts, we have insect and pathogen infestations. These are all linked. And some would argue, oh, it's not that straightforward. Well, it actually is pretty straightforward. These things are links, they're feedbacks to climate change, and it amplifies it, and it will continue as we go forward. So this is, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that there's a lot of misguided thinking out there. There are policies out there that are reinforcing bad practices. These need to be really examined. We have to be extremely careful when we're talking about what the solutions will be, because we can easily go down the wrong track with forests. But the good news is, and I like Tom saying, I'm going to land on the good news. The good news is that there are solutions, and those solutions reside in the forests themselves. They are built to recover, as long as we don't take all the parts away. So how can this be done? Number one is that we still have some old growth left. We have old growth in some very productive ecosystems. Fairy Creek is one example where there's a lot of protests going on. And we need to save these old forests because they continue to be strong sinks for carbon, and they also are highly biodiverse ecosystems. And those two factors are tightly correlated. The second thing is, to shift away from old growth harvesting, we need to then focus on, second growth forests, and to improve what we're doing, to not clear cut them, but to manage them using ecosystem-based management. And that's not happening. So we need to do that. And then the third thing, and then I'm saying it third because we have to be super careful about this, but our government has announced that we're going to be planting billions of trees, and the world leaders have announced trillions of trees as a solution to climate change. It can be, but it has to be done extremely carefully. And I emphasize this because if you do the wrong thing, you can actually make these forests turn into sources of carbon instead of sinks. And by the way, another bit of that, and the urgency of this is that all of our forests around the world, whether you're in the boreal forest, the temperate forests where I live, or in the tropical forests, they have shifted in the last 10 years to being carbon sources instead of sinks. And that is not good news. And so we really, really need to work hard to restore the ability of these forests to take up CO2, to store it in very safe places and soils, in safe compounds, which are, basically, highly evolved processes that are in nature itself. These are nature-based solutions. So we have work to do. We have the ability to be successful. We can't stop. And I'm delighted to be able to talk with this with my beautiful colleagues, Susanna and Tom.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, in terms of those nature-based solutions that you've just outlined in the land use and management, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't often hear any kind of cohesive or comprehensive strategy from the different levels of government on how to tackle this and how to manage it. How well do you think municipalities and towns are doing at protecting or restoring natural ecosystems, and what kind of role do you see the different levels of government doing to work together or what could they do to better manage and promote nature-based climate solutions?
For me, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So, forest management or the cutting levels, the planting, all of that is managed at the provincial level. So it's not a federal jurisdiction, it's provincial. The federal government looks after species at risk, and of course our global response to climate change. meeting the international agreements for biodiversity and carbon. But what actually happens on the ground is under provincial jurisdiction. And then, of course, communities have jurisdiction over their, local boundaries of their municipalities. And I think that's what you're trying to get at. But I think that, for the larger problem, it really is a provincial issue at the bigger scale. In communities, how are they doing? Well, where I live, a lot of the focus is on trying to fire smart their communities. And is this good for ecosystems? Not necessarily. It really depends on, how well they do it. In some ways, they can make it worse than better. So I think that this is a question that is difficult to handle from a forest point of view, just because the municipalities have so little control over what's actually going on around them.
And thanks. And Tom, you've been both in government at the provincial level, and you've been at the federal level in politics as well. What is your perspective on the existing cooperation, the roles? Like, do provinces have the capacity to address this issue? Are they doing a good job? And what role do you see federal or municipal, local level governments doing?
It's a vexing political question for a resource producing country like Canada. Let's not kid ourselves. And the country that's closest to us in terms of misbehavior on climate change is, in fact, Australia. Very similar in terms of the size of the country, the small population in relation to that huge size. We're very sensitive to political arguments. The same arguments were used word for word by the right-wing political parties in Australia to defeat the first attempts at a carbon tax. Oh, this is a tax on everything. This is literally, they were copying each other word for word. So it's worked so far because people have been scared away from it, because international trade agreements that actually lowered the wages and working conditions of the average Canadian and Australian meant that people were more vulnerable to that sort of argument. So we're going to need governments that take this is what has to be done approach. The world came together around COVID-19. The best scientists in the world were able to come and find solutions and put them in place. This is a marvelous sea change in the world. And we can look at that and say, well, when we recognize together that there's a problem, we can actually get it done. So as I was saying at the outset, if you concentrate on the results and the obligation to meet those results, you'll have less of a debate about the means. I no longer get involved in theological debates about whether a carbon tax here or a cap and trade there. Some places one will be better than the other. The important thing is the result. And unfortunately, so far, Canada has really been an outlier in terms of getting to those results.
Okay, thanks. And Susanna, would you like to weigh into this question?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, one of the differences in the, the coastal and marine environment that makes nature-based solutions a little bit easier is that it's mostly under federal jurisdiction. And so Canada has, committed to protecting now 30% of its marine and coastal environment by 2030. We're at about 14%. We went from less than 1% in 2015 to 14% in 2019. And that was at a pace that was very quick, really. And I think there's fewer challenges than the terrestrial environment because you don't need to so much rely on subnational governments. That being said, some provinces are not all in favor of this, of course. I would say the other thing in nature-based solutions in the marine environment is we're really just in the midst of understanding what those are and what that carbon sequestration capacity is. A lot of that work is being done in carbon-rich ecosystems like salt marshes and eelgrass beds. And so it's good that that science is being done. I have yet to see the real work happening between different levels of government to actually really protect those processes. In the deeper sea, there are some new studies showing just how damaging bottom trawling is to the carbon sequestration ecosystem in those deep sediments. Right now, that is not taken into consideration whatsoever in fisheries management. We have had a real lag in considering climate change and fisheries management, whether it's for stock rebuilding, where we fish or how we fish, and that includes on fossil fuel reductions in the fishing industry. So I think first and foremost, and we could do this tomorrow, is stop any further expansion of the trawling industry, particularly into Arctic areas that have never ever been impacted. Right. I would also say that protecting some of the nature-based solutions in coastal areas, and I spoke of salt marshes and eelgrass beds, kelp beds. They're having intact ecosystems like that are a real protection from sea level rise and storm surge. And, we're spending a lot of time hardening our coasts and figuring out how to better build coastal infrastructure. And we're not doing as much work, I think, on making sure that those ecosystems are allowed to recover and remain intact. Another, system maybe is rivers, making sure that we are allowing our rivers to flow and deal with flood mitigation in a better way. So I think there's much to be done, and this is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And I think if Canada could really do tangible things around that, it would be a big step in the right direction. I think, as I mentioned before, Canada has not quite fully linked in its oceans and coasts to its nationally determined contributions. And so that makes that trickle-down effect that we might get from a commitment at the COP26 a little bit harder to sell to provinces in a pan-Canadian climate change framework, because we're not tying those pieces in as effectively as we could. And I will just say, as Suzanne mentions, the natural ecosystems are resilient. If we let them recover, they do. It's miraculous, really. And in many cases, this does require collaboration across governments, incentives from the federal government for partnership with provinces and Indigenous communities and municipalities. And then I think the bottom-up approach is really important. Communities see their coasts eroding. They are concerned about it. Having a way or a pathway for those ecosystems that will mitigate against coastal erosion for local communities to put forward, I think also needs to happen. And right now, a lot of the spatial protection is fairly top-down. I do think it's changing a bit with Indigenous-led protection. So I see hope in this solution. I also don't think it's a panacea, right? So I worry a little bit about nature-based solutions being put forward as something that's easier to do than greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And it has to be kind of both and all at once right now, and ideally 20 years ago, right? So.
Sorry, thanks for that, Susanna. And if I can stay with you on the next question, what do you think we can do better as a society to engage more people in these types of debates and discussions about solutions, of all the solutions related to the climate crisis? And do you have any suggestions in particular that you can see either politicians, governments doing, or the media doing to better engage workers who could be directly affected, or either in a negative way or potentially benefit, and also in terms of engaging Black, Indigenous, or people of color into these conversations, and encouraging more engagement and participation, and inviting them to be part of these discussions?
Yeah, I think federal elections are a good way of engaging people in these discussions. I do feel that people are talking about this in a way that they haven't before, and that's happening, across rural and urban environments. I think the heat wave that ended up, with hundreds of deaths really struck home in Canada. We have not had that happen before here. So I do feel that people are talking about it. I think some of the solutions are often beyond individual action. And so while you may have all the information, finding that agency to make the change is often challenging. I think one way of engaging people is really having them tell their stories of their own solutions. Communities are taking action. Individual businesses are taking action. I think developing narratives and have the news media cover those positive stories is really important right now, because it will build momentum. I think, we often put our government in a difficult spot where we want them to fix everything, and then we get angry at them when they try to, or we punish them. And I think we need to find a way through that, right? And I think, I think of some of the urgency perhaps in the Arctic, where we have, a real need for better housing, and at the same time, the permafrost is melting, and there is no kind of housing that you can make that can withstand melting permafrost, right? So in some communities, and Indigenous communities in particular, we're still dealing with water issues, as we know. I think sometimes climate is something they've been seeing climate change has been seeing happen for a long time. There are very urgent issues, right, that are taking precedent. And so in that case, I think the engagement of those regional governments is very important. The just transition is really important, but there's no silver bullet. Just means different things to different communities, and people experience inequities in different ways. It comes down to the really hard work. It's really hard work, and it's really hard work at the community level. I think with the labor unions, I think again, with new immigrants, being able to tell the stories that feel like they're part of the solution is vital. And I, COVID, Tom mentioned this too, but COVID has shown us the vast inequities in our society, right? And climate change is showing us that too, and it will continue to make that all the more visible. So I don't think there's a path forward without a just transition. Dealing with inequality and climate change simultaneously, it's going to be difficult, but we don't actually have a choice, right? Because we have delayed on both of those things, and some of the solutions we've looked towards have increased inequities. So yeah, maybe that's telling stories and getting those stories out there, I think is really important.
Thanks, Susanna. And yeah, and I do want to dive a bit deeper into the just transition concept a bit later. But Suzanne, what are your thoughts about engaging or improving engagement with a wider swath of civil society?
I completely agree with Susanna that people want to be engaged. We're living with climate change now. Where I live in British Columbia, we were, in the midst of that heat dome, people were literally dropping dead on the streets. In my little town of Nelson, there was so much smoke from the wildfires, of which there were 300 burning throughout the summer, 5 right around my town. There was so much smoke. They were telling us it was like we were smoking 65 cigarettes a day. And this went on and on and on through the summer. And people, we're witnessing, climate migrations from this already, right? People were migrating to the coast, and just before they migrated to the interior to get away from COVID. And so it's going to be this back and forth scramble to actually have a healthy life. So this is here, it's real. And so people are really, really worried. And of course, I teach undergraduate students who are 19 and 20 who, it's more than worry. It's an existential crisis, and they know it. And so, what are some of the solutions? Well, I agree there needs to be bottom up and top down approaches. So let's talk about the top down first. Obviously, we need to do the basic things like decarbonize our energy sector, which is not going to be easy because there's all kinds of misinformation, poor information. In forests, for example, there's a hope for, converting some of our dependence on fossil fuels into bioenergy. But when we look at how we're doing that now, there are heavy subsidies that don't make sense in order to promote this. And the impact on the ecosystems are unknown, but my prediction is they're very negative because they're releasing a lot of CO2 in the process of trying to, to substitute fossil fuels with biomass. We have to think so carefully of the whole chain of carbon costs and benefits from this. But, from the top down, we need excellent policy at the highest levels. We need excellent targets that we can stick to, agree on, that we will meet. Otherwise, we're not going to make it there. So that's got to include reducing fossil fuels and then building up renewable energy sources in a way that actually does work, and that we monitor and keep track of it and make sure we're counting things properly. From the bottom up, to get people engaged, the problem in forestry in British Columbia, as an example, is that most of our forest harvesting activities is concentrated in 5 major corporations, and very little of it is managed by local communities. So they feel disconnected. They're frustrated. They can see their landscapes being clear-cut around them, and yet jobs are not accruing in their communities, especially First Nations communities. Using Haida Gwaii as one example, where basically Graham Island is slated for clear cutting. This is where the Haida depend on cedar and salmon. They're people of the forest, and yet they're seeing their forest dismantled and shipped overseas as raw logs. And only a small percentage of the people are getting employed in forestry. And in fact, youth in Old Masset and Masset is 70% unemployment. So there's some major disconnections here. And so we need to really put the forests of the local people back into their hands. We need to divest our investment in these major corporations, which really don't care about these local communities other than the handful of jobs. And let me just emphasize, only 2% of our employment from British Columbia now is from forestry because of this concentration and mechanization. So And yet the potential for employment in forests is huge if we were to, to use more craftsman-like methods. And we can do that. We have the knowledge to do it. So, and so how do you, wrest the control from the big majors? That's a political decision that I'm afraid that our government is shirking and putting it into the courts, and the courts don't know how to solve these problems. These are the problems for governments. That's why we elect governments. But they're doing things like subsidizing the big majors to harvest our forests, and the jobs and the money isn't accruing back to the communities. So we need to decentralize the control of our forests, put it in the hands of First Nations, put it in the hands of local communities, make sure that the vehicles are there for them to earn a living from the forest. And that doesn't necessarily mean cutting down the forest. If we properly value forests, we can have jobs that are not about exploitation, but about regenerative kinds of policies in forests that actually, look after our forests instead of exploit them. So yes, there's many things we could discuss there, but there are solutions.
So Suzanne, can you maybe expand on what does that world that is effectively addressing climate change, what does it look like in terms of the forests and jobs in the forest, the industry there, and life for those local communities?
Yeah. So, it's become a moral issue, right? And the harvesting or the cutting down of our old growth forests is morally wrong. And I say that because, and the kids know it, the elders know it, the First Nations people know it, even though they're conflicted by all of the colonial rules that have been put in place. And so, there's really, you can't make an argument ecologically or even socially or even economically, if we're completely honest about our subsidies for cutting down these old forests. So what do we do? How do we get jobs when we're not going to be cutting down forests and turning them into 2x4s? Well, there's been a number of some economic analysis of other ways that these forests are used. So for example, tourism is a major source of income. Harvesting non-timber forest products like mushrooms and berries and food from the forest is also a major source of income. Fish, the fisheries industry is huge, and the link between the oceans and the land, although we haven't understood that very well, is very strong. And so protecting our forests helps the intertidal zone. It helps the fishery, especially the salmon fishery, and then the other big elephant in the room is carbon. So, for valuing our forests for carbon is actually a really interesting concept, because carbon represents all kinds of health in an ecosystem. We're all made of carbon. The soil, the soil is made of carbon. The creatures in the soil are made of carbon. And so carbon actually is correlated with biodiversity, and it's correlated with clean water and clean air. And so if we can protect carbon, it's a great umbrella for these other values as well. And so I think we need to shift to a carbon economy so that these forests are valued for these things other than cutting down the trees. How do people get jobs in that? Well, they can get jobs in that looking after the forests, like our First Nations people did for thousands of years, for taking great care in how the forest is managed, for looking at those trees that they want to harvest and leave behind what they need to be left behind, instead of taking what I call the McDonald's approach to forestry, which is just to take everything. So we can create really good craftsman jobs from better forest management, more hands-on forest management that is going to protect our ecosystems as well.
Okay, thanks. So this concept of a just transition, which we've mentioned now a few times, I guess my understanding of a just transition is it needs to be creating a plan that acknowledges that a large number of jobs in a low carbon economy are going to be disappearing, and that we need to find a responsible way to help support those workers who are threatened by the climate crisis, and the way that it's going to force us to change our industry, our economies, that we have to find ways to move them into jobs in a responsible and a fair way. So, Tom, maybe a question for you. In federal politics, we've had the Liberal government that has been talking about this concept of a just transition for a few years now. Over the summer, right before the election campaign, they announced that they were starting a just transition engagement, is the word they used. They released a discussion paper to frame this discussion. As they announced it, what I noticed in their announcement is that the words oil, gas, and coal were nowhere to be found in their announcement of this engagement process. So why do you think these words are being avoided in the discussion, and what does it tell you about Canada's path to achieving the current federal government's role of net zero emissions by 2050?
Well, we've got to be so careful also, because there will be, of course, those who will argue that we already have a definition of net zero, but no, we don't. Not one that everybody agrees on anyway. That idea of a just transition's been around for a long time, but it can also be just a nice term to mask the fact that we're still doing nothing. So we've got to argue in favor of results, and compelling results. I mean, that's the number one thing. I'd also say, as somebody who spent a long time in politics, that we need a lot less partisanship. This has got to be something where everybody starts pulling together, and somebody has to be able to rise above that. In the recent election campaign we just had federally, there was a big fight over whether or not this plan or that plan. We've never gotten it done in Canada. And we do have some really good, smart people working on these things. And, you know, it's a basic tenet of public administration. You can't manage that which you can't count. And we talk about what we produce. When we get our 2020 numbers, some people will probably say, look, our industries are producing less. Yeah, because a closed factory doesn't produce greenhouse gases. But under the filings that have to be provided every year, and that's what was so interesting to me listening to Suzanne before, but the fact that everything is connected. The filings under the Paris Accord require us to give information on things like land use changes, agriculture, forest fires, and the amount of carbon giving up the ghost in the forest fires that we've had out of control in Canada for the past few years far outweigh any attempt. So we've got to come to the simple realization that what we're doing hasn't worked, that we've got to stop talking as if we know the solutions, and we're doing them. We know the solutions, but we're not doing them. The International Energy Agency, Mike, at the beginning, you gave us a nice litany of the reports from the United Nations and the like, but the International Energy Agency, just a couple of weeks ago, completely flipped its approach and started talking about what had to be done. In the past, they would just provide a snapshot of what the undertakings were from the various governments. And now they're saying, you've got to leave this stuff in the ground. And that was a toxic thing. I went through it. I had a candidate in the 2015 election who clearly said, oh, you know, we're going to have to leave a lot of this in the ground. And we were going, oh, you can't say it. Well, if you can't say it, then you're never going to get it done. We've got to start being able to say it. Even in an energy rich and a resource rich country like Canada, we've got to start being honest with ourselves. We can't keep destroying the forests because of the result that Suzanne just described. Suzanne's anecdote about being a student and learning about the shutting down of the cod fishery, we've seen this over and over again. In terms of the cost, it's worth bearing in mind that the biggest investment firms in the world, the biggest investment funds in the world are simply drawing away now from these resources, but they're still going to be developed by other people who will assume the risk, and maybe long-term they're a little bit less worried about that. But Nordhaus, Romer, two Americans who won the Nobel Prize for economics, have shown us that it's absolutely proven that the Porter hypothesis was right. We've known about this for a long time. Nicholas Stern's book about what the cost would be if we don't deal with climate change has been out there for years. We know the math on this. We've just got to start getting it done. I retain one last thing. It is a principle of sustainable development that you apply this notion of subsidiarity, and that's what we're seeing more and more. Back in the early 70s, when you were creating the first ministries to deal with pollution, because people were starting to realize in the wake of the writings and the realization of Santa Barbara, tankers breaking apart on the coast, and the first Earth Day 50 years ago, people wanted some action. And the federal government, whether it was in the States or here, would grab hold of this. And it would be a top-down approach. And Suzanne's right. You have to include communities, regional governments, provincial governments. Everybody's got to be involved in this fight. A lot of cities in Canada are doing great work on fighting climate change. But now we've got to get the provinces on board. Some are involved in what Nordhaus and Romer would call climate clubs, like the Western Climate Initiative that Quebec's in, BC withdrew from, has not gotten back in on. So we know what has to be done, Mike. My biggest fear, I don't have a lot to fear, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. It's just the reality. I don't have a lot to fear from what's going to happen in 50 years. But when I attended my first COP conference in Milan, Italy, it was the COP9. And I can tell you back then, they were already, this is in 2003, and we were already pushing things forward. Well, now the target will be 2015 or 2020. So every time I hear somebody talk about 2050, I'd like to talk about 2022. I'd like to know where we're going to be 2 years from now, not 30 years from now. And I'd like a government that actually acts upon that. Mr. Trudeau's going to be bringing in a new cabinet, whom he puts in charge of natural resources and environment. Will say a lot about whether or not we're actually going to get it done.
So from the future, maybe looking back at the past, the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is celebrating 25 years. So perhaps Susanna, how do you think the conversations that we're having today, 2021, how would they compare to the climate discussions that you might have recalled from 1994?
Well, you know what, I think the difference, maybe not that much of a difference. We definitely have scientific consensus, right? There is no further debate whatsoever. I think I was just reading an article the other day where it's like 99.9% sure that humans are causing this. So we don't have to discuss that anymore. I don't think. I think for the most part, at least in Canada, we do have political consensus that this is a problem and that we need to deal with it. We had all federal parties with a climate plan for the first time last year, right? So we have political consensus. Those two things I think are different than 25 years ago. But we don't have the action that's needed, right? And so we need to bring those two things together and really push them. I think the other thing is the equity discussion is certainly different and has increased from 25 years ago. And then I would say the urgency is absolutely everywhere, right? Again, if we'd acted on this stuff 25 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about the urgency of today, but we know we have less than a decade to really, if there's any hope of keeping it to 1.5 degrees increase, we may have lost that at this point. So I think now we have all the building blocks in place. Should be absolutely nothing keeping us from making very bold commitments, in Glasgow in the next couple of weeks, and also coming home with them. And, I fully agree with Tom that we need to be very, we do need to lead on the ground. I just saw the government of Quebec, which is very reliant on hydroelectricity, but did say it's leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And so having Quebec reach out to a couple more provinces that don't rely heavily on fossil fuels would be really a strong message, right? If we start to get those different provinces working together. I think the other thing is we have just gone through COVID. That is something that we have not experienced in 100 years in terms of a global pandemic. And we knew what we learned, how to respond to a human health emergency, right? Yet we have governments who have declared climate emergencies and the next day have done nothing. And so it's when people hear an emergency declared, but then nothing changes, you kind of lose is it an emergency or not? I think COVID has been very good at that wake-up call. That is an emergency. Provinces, countries have been in states of emergency, and that state of emergency has radically changed how we've acted as individuals. So, I think that's kind of the next stage, is that we need to have a real state of emergency declared, and work as if we mean it. I think things are different. I think it's good that they're different, and it's also tragic that they're different, right? Because they're different because we haven't done what we should have done 25 years ago.
And Suzanne, what do you think has changed over the past 25 years?
Enormous changes from the forest perspective. So I was in graduate school in 1994, and I remember going to this seminar that was put on by the EPA. I was in Corvallis in Oregon at Oregon State University, and it was the first time, I guess it was 93, that I'd heard about climate change. The EPA there were a bunch of big, heavy duty administrators in there, and there were scientists. And I remember, and it was this little tiny room with a little light bulb dangling down, and it was packed with grad students and professors. And they put up the Keeling curve, and the Keeling curve shows CO2 increases since the 1950s. And I'm just like, I couldn't, I'm just like, oh my God, I'd been working on, biodiversity and stopping herbicide spraying and, little stuff like that. And then I realized that the problem was way worse, way more urgent. And so I came home to British Columbia, and I was working in government at the time when I was in school, and I told the people in government about climate change, and they're like, what? They said, no way, basically knew nothing about it and didn't believe it. And it took another decade for it to start to seep into the consciousness of British Columbia forestry. And now here we are, we're living in a climate crisis that we're all feeling, pretty much every day in this province. So now, yes, that's a huge change, isn't it? From absolutely no way to, oh my God, we're in this. And I think the other thing, so another important thing that has changed, not just the recognition and the consciousness, but the forests have changed. And so in the last 10 years, our forests, the boreal forests of Canada and the temperate forests on the coasts, have changed from being a net sink for CO2 in Canada to being a net source. That happened about 10 years ago. And that is huge. And the other part of this is, and that's true for all the forests around the world now, but the other part of this is that forestry in the national carbon counting is not counted. I think Tom mentioned this. None of the forestry activities are counted, not even wildfires. And that is because there has always been the assumption that our forests are big sinks for carbon. And so we don't have to pay any attention. No matter what we do, they'll continue to be sinks. Well, now they're not. They're sources, and we're still stuck in this old thinking that it's a neutral thing. Anything we do on the forest landscape is neutral. We need to start counting this. When people actually do a proper accounting with the little data that we actually have, they show that emissions from forestry, including wildfires in British Columbia, is about 2 to 3 times higher than emissions from fossil fuels. We need to get real about this and really start acknowledging, counting, and then, and I agree, we have solutions. We've had a weak-kneed approach to all of this, and we need to really, we really need to be transformational at this point, not tinkering around the edges trying to solve the problem.
Thanks, Suzanne. And Tom, I think I remember you were elected for the first time in '94 in Chamonix. Do you think that there's or what kind of differences do you see in the political conversations that you remember from that year versus 2021?
I'll go back 25 years before that and say that in 1971 at Vanier College, I took my first course in what was called ecology. And I remember seeing a picture of a river in the United States that had caught fire. It was so polluted. And we were in that zone where we were talking a lot about pesticides, inspired by Rachel Carson's work and learning that a lot of the industrial pollution was producing horrible results. And that was at that level. But it's taken a long time to get to the level we're at today, to understand something simple. That Carson, in fact, I think was the first person to use the word ecosystems. So whether it's Susanna's tremendous work on the coasts with the fisheries, Suzanne's incredible work. I mean, it's extraordinary, this idea of everything being connected physically as well. This has brought us forward. But I'd say, Mike, the biggest change in the 25 years is what I'm seeing, because at the time I was also teaching university, what I'm seeing now is the change in the students. Very determined, getting it done, not willing to listen to excuses and having everything shoveled forward. If you're trying to shovel the snow off your walkway and you keep shoveling it forward, you're going to hit a wall that you've created yourself. And that's where we are right now. I asked a quick question of my class at the beginning of the year. I have a graduate class with 77 students, a big group, and from all around the world. And I said, just a quick question like that. How many of you no longer eat meat? And about 80% of the hands went up. So, digging down a little bit. What's this about? Well, some of it's ethical, concern about animals, but a lot of it has to do with climate change. They know that the methane emissions and so forth, and they're also aware that we have to have changes in our agricultural procedures and what we do with grasslands and the like. So this is a sea change, because I think that generation, it's always generational, and we always talk about our obligation to future generations. But I dare say the biggest change is that future generations have decided to grab this thing on their own and say, thank you, Grow Highland Brundtland, for talking about this for the first time, but governments aren't getting this done. We're going to be part of the solution, because it's a solution that determines whether or not we get to continue.
Okay, and that kind of raises the question, the last thing I was going to ask all of you about is what kind of lessons or what do you think would be the most important lesson that you could teach a first year university class? From what you just said, maybe they're the ones that would teach us more, but if there were to be one important lesson that you've learned over the years, about the climate crisis, what would that be? And maybe start again with you, Tom.
This might be surprising, but I always preach, and I never try to push them towards one party or the other, but I always preach that with the incredibly busy lives they have, and they're so connected with each other, and they often say to me, you know, what you guys doing, meaning in politics, doesn't affect us. We get things done locally. We're on, social media together. I always plead that they learn more about and find a little bit of time in their incredibly busy schedules for politics, whether it's a local community thing, whether it's their municipality, whether it's their province. Attend a meeting, learn a little bit about the process, figure it out, because what's being decided at Queen's Park or in Victoria, BC, or in Quebec City or in Ottawa, it's going to have a determining effect for the rest of their lives. If they want to be part of it, if they want to help shape their future, until that system changes, if it ever does, then knowing how it works and how to change it and how to get a better result, that has to be something that's also on their plates.
Thanks. And Suzanne, what would be your words of wisdom for a first year university class of students on the climate crisis?
Yeah, I totally agree with Tom that, the first thing is go vote and uphold our democracy and understand your parties for sure. And then the second thing is, a lot of students, when I started teaching about climate change about 10 years ago, it created a lot of depression among my students. And then I shifted, I did this for a couple of years and then I shifted and I thought, I've got to talk about climate solutions, not climate change. They go hand in hand, but, and this is a lesson for scientists and all of us too, is that we can count and watch climate changing. We're really good at measuring it. Look at it's changing, but we're not actually acting. And that's been said over and over today. And so I think for kids in those universities that are feeling anxious, feeling depressed, I have two daughters that are at that age, and I've watched it in my own family, is to have agency in your future, right? So that means voting, but there's also all kinds of other things you can do. And you can work on the inside, tinkering with government. Governments are really reticent to change. They like their infrastructure and they don't want to really change things too much. But what we need is transformational change. And so working inside is okay, but it's not the whole solution. You need people on the outside as well. And so what's happening with young people when they see governments are not acting on their behalf, that they're dragging their feet, they're not putting forward solutions, they're taking up and they're protesting. And they're going to Fairy Creek. There's been like the biggest civil disobedience action in British Columbia and all of Canada just happening right now with over 1,000 people arrested. Well, there's all kinds of complexities, but it gives them agency. They feel like they're doing something that gives them hope. Another way is to engage them in the resource management of their communities, of their forests. And, I hire many students every year to work on solutions for forests. They love it. They feel like they're part of the solution. So there's many ways to engage, but once you're engaged and once you feel you have agency, that depression falls away and you just say, okay, let's get it done. So I'd say to my students, keep up hope and keep acting.
Thanks. And Susanna, what would be your message?
Well, I wrote a few notes on this, and my first thing was teaching agency as well, right? That it's possible to do something with the information that you have. I've learned, I would teach them how decisions get made. Often people don't know kind of the sausage making of a decision or the vegan sausage making of a decision. And I think in particular, if they're science students, who are the students I interact with the most, I would urge them to read broadly, read the news and read multiple types of news. and then think about how science gets communicated, and then constantly remind them to think of the context within which the science is being taught and being done, that there are social and equity and political contexts, and that science still exists within humanity in all of its complexities, right? Because sometimes we get a little bit narrow in our thinking of how we can use this science. And that it's a really important piece of the puzzle of the solutions, but it's only just one. I think one of the most important things I learned over time, I thought if I did a PhD, I could be part of the solution. Then I realized I needed to know all the international policy to understand how the science could be incorporated. Then at some point I realized I needed to know about economics and how those decisions are made. And increasingly, I just think it's about psychology on it. So that was sort of my trajectory in thinking, and why I continue to work in the non-government world. I guess I would remind them that there's examples of ecosystems and populations that have recovered, that have come back. The great whales have come back. We have coastal ecosystems that have come back. We have kelp forests that come back. And there's many places in the world that don't have a lot of human activity, and those places are incredibly important to protect. And I guess the final thing, I would urge them to go outside, like be in nature, make sure every single week, like you do something that is outside, not on your screen. Learn the names of the plants you walk by, just so you have, you can talk to them, and really understand the deep appreciation for those natural systems, because when you have that, you learn how to work to save them, I think. And then, one of the things is pick a front line to be on at one point in your undergrad, so that you're interacting with people in communities and learning how to take risks. I find a lot of people are a bit risk averse, or particularly people who work in bureaucracies become risk averse. And I think we really need to teach students how to take those risks, and give them different ways of experiencing risk. So that's what I would do. That's what I try and do. So.
All right, thanks very much for that. So clearly, like, there's a lot of work to be done, but from all of you, I've heard a lot of reasons for optimism and opportunities. So thanks. It's been an inspiring chat. Thanks to you, Tom, to Suzanne and Susanna for being with us here today, sharing your insight. Thanks to everyone who has joined us for this great conversation. Thanks to the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and on behalf of the Institute, we hope everyone watching enjoys the rest of the conference. Thank you, merci beaucoup, and all the best.